I read an article that 1 billion, with a B, lottery tickets were sold this week just across the border down in the States. And maybe you heard a little bit about the $1.5 billion jackpot that was available through the Powerball. How many of the people who went in to buy their tickets, maybe one, maybe who knows how many, said a little prayer to God, God, let me be the winner of this jackpot. I promise that if I win, I will give a big part of it back to you, or something along those lines. How many people do you think said a prayer like that? How many people do you think pray to God for many other things, small things, and wonder, does God really care about these things? Does God care about the lottery? Does God care about the student who's praying, Lord, let me get into the university that I want to? Lord, give me good weather for my ski trip this weekend. That would make me so happy to enjoy your creation in beautiful sunshine. Even right now, today, this weekend is the NFL playoffs. How many people do you think are praying that their team will win the game, while fans of the other team are praying to God that their team will win the game? Do you think God cares about who wins a football game? Or about the weather on your ski trip? Or about which university you might get into? We certainly do. These things matter a great deal to us. They are very important to us. The young person, the single woman who feels alone and has been praying, God, bless me with someone to love, a husband. And prays and prays and prays, but does God care that she feels lonely? The student who works so hard to get into university and puts all this pressure on himself, praying, God, just help me get a good mark on my test, help me get the grades I need so that I can get in. And wonders, does God really care? If there are 7 billion people in the world, and every single one of us is praying to God for something that we want, how can God care about each and every one of those prayers and longings and wishes and desires? I remember some time ago, a little girl who is part of my church, her cat got lost. And so she requested of our church and of me that we would pray for her lost cat. And so we did. In church, during the prayer of the church, we prayed for her lost cat, that her cat was safe, that her cat would have a nice place to sleep tonight, as she asked, and that her cat would ultimately come home. Week in and week out, for several weeks, over a month, we prayed for this little girl's lost cat. One day after church, an older gentleman mumbled to me under his breath, "Aren't there more important things we could be praying about than a cat?" Now, I thought the comment he made was rather insensitive, frankly. But as I went home and thought about it, about myself, I thought, what about the things that I pray to God for? Do they really matter in the grand scheme of things? That God should care about what is important to me? God helps us today to understand what he thinks about things that are important to us through this story that we have in John 2, when Jesus and a few of his disciples, very, very early in his ministry, go to attend a wedding at Cana in Galilee. Now, it was just a few kilometers from his hometown in Nazareth. And it wasn't all of his disciples who came. At most, it was 6 of them, the ones that he had met so far. And he goes to this wedding, and at the wedding, well, as you know how the story goes, there's a problem. The groom the wedding party, they run out of wine. This is potentially a very socially embarrassing moment for them. To run out of wine at your own wedding would be terrible. What would the people drink? The Jews in Jesus' day used wine not just as a drink like we might, but they mixed it with water even so that their water was drinkable and it tasted all right. And especially considering that weddings in Jewish culture would go on for days on end, the idea of running out of wine was, well, it was not good. And so, Mary, who was also at this wedding, goes to Jesus with the problem. She slips in among the group of the men who were separated from the women, as they would have done, to let Jesus know about the problem, as we hear here. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." It's easy to see how close this wedding was to Jesus' hometown by the very fact that his mother happened to also be there at the wedding, perhaps a family friend of Jesus. And she was doing what you might expect a mother to do, showing that she really knew this family well, that she would be behind the scenes worrying about what's going on, making sure that all the details were just right for the guests. And then when the wine runs out, well, she's the first to know. The groom didn't know. Not even the master of the banquet knew what was happening yet. But Mary knew. And so she was going to deal with it. And she goes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, they have no more wine." How does he reply? What we might expect, actually. "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." Jesus should have more important things to concern himself about at this wedding, shouldn't he? His hour and his purpose was not to solve problems at weddings, making sure that there were enough drinks on the tables for people. That is not why Jesus came. And the hour that he's thinking of, as he says, "My hour has not yet come," just so happens to be the only other time in the Gospel of John where Mary shows up in the story. The hour in which Jesus' arms were stretched out on the cross, dying for the sins of the world. That's why he came. And maybe you remember what he said to Mary on that occasion. "Woman, here is your son." And to John, "Here is your mother." It sounds a lot like the way he addresses her here. "Woman, why do you involve me?" Why should Jesus concern himself with the affairs of a wedding when he had new disciples that needed training up? When there were people there that he probably wanted to speak with and to instruct and to care about? Why should Jesus care that they're running out of wine? It reminds me of another story that I heard from another pastor who told me about a husband and a wife who'd been married for 50 years when the wife passed away. And so their children were in the home after the funeral, going through all the things in the house and trying to clear things out so they could move dad to a new place. And one of the sons came up from the basement, and he said to everyone, "Look what I found. It's a jar of Mom's pickles. There's lots of them downstairs." So he opens the lid and starts to give out the pickles to everyone else in the house and offers them to his dad, and he says, "No thanks." And the son looks at him kind of puzzled, like, "Dad, Mom made these pickles for you all the time. You love them." And he said, "Nope. I've had my share of pickles. I actually hate pickles, but I love your mom. He ate all those pickles, not because he loved them, but because his wife loved them. And he loved them because of her. In a sense, this is what Jesus is doing here at this wedding. The reason that he's there, the reason that he even now would get involved is not because he cares so much about wine that's at a wedding, but because he cares about people. He cares about you. He cares about me. And because he cares about us, that means he also cares about what we care about. It matters to God when someone cries out to him, Lord, I feel lonely. It matters to God when a student who's working so hard prays and prays and prays, Lord, help me get into the school that I want to get into. These things matter to God because we matter to God, just as we see Jesus acting in this story as he carries it out. We continue. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Jesus is the God who turns water into wine. He is the God who came to this wedding for this friend of his, this groom and bride, and offers them such a delicious example of wine that the master of the ceremonies is shocked. He's surprised by how good it was. Jesus is the God who turns water into wine. He is the God who helps a little girl's cat that's been lost be found and answers her prayer. He is the God who answers the prayer of a person who's lonely and giving them a spouse to love. Jesus is the God who helps a couple on the brink of divorce save their marriage when he puts one of them in the hospital. He is the God who helps a congregation that's on the verge of closing because of finances by discovering that there is a $500,000 gift that they had missed, that hadn't been noted properly in the books and was sitting there waiting for them. He is the God who helps a man who thinks he has a debilitating disease discover that really it was just a shortage of a certain kind of vitamin. Jesus turns water into wine. And sometimes we don't even know it. As you saw in the story we just read, not everyone knew what had happened. Just his disciples, a few of the servants, and Mary. The master of the banquet didn't know. The groom didn't know. And yet Jesus does this act of grace, this act of love for them that goes beyond what they had ever imagined or could have imagined. But are there times when we feel like Jesus, instead of turning water into wine for us and giving us blessings that we've been praying for, asking for, instead he does the opposite? He turns our wine into water. The student who really wanted to get into university gets the rejection letter. The couple who've been praying earnestly for a baby find out it's not going to happen. the congregation that's been working so hard to share the gospel, to grow, and praying that that would happen, just doesn't seem to be working. Jesus also sometimes turns water or wine into water. And perhaps he does that not because he doesn't want to bless us, but because at times we start to love the blessing that he gives us, the gift that he gives us, more than the one who gives it to us. And when he does that, when he turns the wine into water, he's reminding us of a very important lesson. Namely that for him, his life was not all about turning water into wine, but it was quite the opposite, wasn't it? That his wine is turned into water. That the cup that he would drink from would be the cup of suffering. That he would take upon himself the sins of the whole world. And that he would go to a cross and die for us. If you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed to God the Father, "Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me." But God's answer was no. He would have to drink the cup of suffering for us. And he would have to stretch out his arms and die. That was the hour that Jesus was waiting for. When he said, "My hour has not yet come," he's already thinking about the cross. He's already thinking about what he would do to save and love us and give us what we need the most, so that he can turn our water into wine. My friends, this is grace. This is God's love for us, poured out even though we don't deserve it. This is the kind of love that Jesus gives us in the moment that we need him the most. But that's not where he stops, of course. And we see that demonstrated in this beautiful story from John 2. That Jesus cares and loves us so much that even something that is minor in comparison to the cross, he gives with grace that goes beyond what we would expect. I'm sure that the master of the banquet who brought the wine to the groom and tasted it was shocked at just how good it was. And I like to imagine for myself that this wine that Jesus made was probably the best wine that there ever was. I wouldn't put it past Jesus to make the best wine in the history of the world for that wedding. And for all the people there to be drinking it and not really get it or be aware of that fact. But if you sit for even a minute and calculate and think about how much of this wine that he made, it's mind-blowing. Those 6 stone water jars that he turned into wine, if you were to dump them out and make them into modern bottles of wine, would come out to somewhere between 640 and 960 bottles of wine. That is a lot of wine. It's not because Jesus was somehow encouraging the guests to get drunk. Not at all. But it just shows the lavishness, the generosity with which he wants to give his grace to us. And they didn't even know. Just the right grace at just the right time, and the people were completely unaware. They had no idea. When you think about it that way, you do have to stand back and just think about your own life and how many ways has God showered us with this kind of grace, this kind of love, keeping us safe, keeping us healthy, or putting us in the hospital at just the right time so that our faith might rest on him. I think about all the people who are praying that God would bless them in a way by letting them win the lottery this last week of $1.5 billion. People who spent their time daydreaming that God would bless them in this way. And if you weren't daydreaming about that, there are probably other ways where we do daydream, may God bless me in this thing or in that way. But then we see this story in John 2. And we step back and look at our lives in the good that happens where Jesus has turned our water into wine, and in places where it seems like he's turned our wine into water. And we realize that he does give us his grace. Just the right kind of grace for us. And that leads us, with his disciples, to do what they did. As John says, believe in him. Trust in him. Amen.